everybody, really lovely to see you all. Happy VE Day. What a gorgeous day for it, apart from whoever's in Belfast. Sorry about that. But I know a lot of you have been on some of these talks earlier on this week and been to some of the events. For those of you who haven't, I'm Annabel Smith. My job is I'm a beer sommelier, I'm a writer, I'm a trainer. I run a company called Beerbelle. I'm also co-author of a couple of research reports which examine the relationship between relationship and attitudes women have between beer and pubs in modern times in the UK. So I'll reference these at the end of the session. I think just for ease of this, what I'll do is I'll go through the talk that I've prepared, and then I'm more than happy to kind of answer any questions you've got right at the end. So we've kind of got a bit of a flow to this. Right, a little bit of information. At the moment, the UK still has one of the lowest rates of female beer drinkers in the world. And yet the proportion of women going to pubs is higher than men. In fact, 51% of women cite that they go to the pub more than once a week, whereas only 49% of men say that's the case. So when Women on Tap asked me to put together a short talk on women, beer and pubs during the Second World War, it immediately grabbed my interest, partly because I thought it might just shed some light on why we have some prevailing attitudes, or women have some prevailing attitudes towards beer and pubs in modern times. So I'm going to share my screen with you so you don't have to just look at me whilst I'm going through all this information. Let me find the screen that I want. Rachel, can you confirm that that screen's come up? Yep, brilliant. Okay, so title of my talk is Women, Beer and Pubs in Wartime Britain. So when I first started researching this, the first issue that I encountered was there's actually very little documented information or data sources combining all those topics: women plus beer plus pubs plus Second World War. So the first thing I want to do is reference two rich seams of information that I found. And the first was a very academic article published in the Women's History Review, which was written by a lady called Claire Langamer in 2003. And I'm absolutely indebted to her research because she signposted me in the right direction. And the title of her paper was "A Public House is for All Classes, Men and Women Alike. Women, Leisure and Drink in Second World War England." Now, because of Claire's article, the second seam of information I found was something some of you may be familiar with. I wasn't. It's an organisation called Mass Observation. Just going to try and bring up my next screen. Got the next screen up? Let's go back to it. Bear with me, we've got lots of technology going on here. And we're going forward. Right, let me just carry on whilst we try and get this, get my screen showing to all of you. And Rachel, if you can do any help, it will be fantastic. Right, so Mass Observation. Mass Observation was a United Kingdom social research organisation founded in 1937. Now, their work ended in the mid-1960s, but it was revived again in 1981, and the archives are housed at the University of Sussex. So what Mass Observation was it aimed to record everyday life in Britain through a panel of about 500 untrained volunteer observers who either maintained diaries or replied to open-ended questionnaires known as directives. And they also paid investigators to anonymously record people's conversations and behaviours at work or on the street, at various public occasions, including public meetings and sporting and religious events. They also recorded conversations in pubs. So Can you bear with me and let me just see if I can get, there we go. Can you all see that? Fantastic, we're working again. Right, so mass observation was formed in the aftermath of the abdication crisis, and it sought to bridge the gap between how the media represented public opinion and what actually ordinary people were thinking and feeling. Now, it sounds really, really Orwellian and a little bit sinister, but it was a group of 4 anthropologists who put this together, and the amount of information in these archives is bizarre. They investigated some of the most bizarre topics, one of which was pub, and they published a book called The Pub and the People. So for the purpose of this talk, I've identified where we were before the war in terms of beer drinking and pub going, and then the factors that influenced women throughout the Second World War, their attitudes and behaviours towards pub usage, and then what happened straight after the Second World War. So, pre-war, pub visiting was rarely mentioned as a form of leisure activity, especially amongst working class and lower middle class women. In fact, almost all of the women interviewees within that demographic asserted that women, particularly young unmarried women, rarely viewed the pub as a leisure activity or a leisure venue. In fact, it was really frowned upon for a young woman to go into a pub. And middle class attitudes towards female beer drinkers seemed to be particularly harsh. So one lady, Ada, recalled of the interwar period, just before the Second World War, she said, "Oh, women didn't. If you went to a pub, you were a prostitute. In those days, nice women didn't go. You might go to a country pub on a holiday or a walking tour, you know, that sort of thing, but not a town pub down a side street. It was generally frowned upon." It was just about acceptable for a working class woman, usually over 40, to visit a pub and have a beer, but she must be accompanied by her husband. So working class women under 25 were less likely to use the public house as a regular leisure venue. In fact, they actively seemed not to want to go because they wanted additional attractions, such as they wanted to go to a dance, they wanted a music hall, they wanted the cinema. They would really only go to a pub if it was located close to a dance hall for interval drinks. And recalling her years as a young woman, another interviewee pre-war said, going in pubs, well, it sounds awful, but it was a working men's thing. Working class women, especially young women, concurred that quite simply, women didn't. However, there was a bit of a class divide because middle class women were quite happy to drink in and be seen in what they classified as nicer establishments, such as hotel bars. So in places like hotel bars, the clientele was made up of 40% female patrons, whereas in the backstreet pubs, it was only a maximum of 26% of women made up the patrons, and even that was only on a weekend. So there were massive efforts made by the brewers who owned most of the pubs in between the wars to improve public houses. They made a determined effort to attract women, particularly middle-class women who had a bit more money. And they did this by creating respectable lounges in reformed city centre pubs or suburban inns, or classifying the pubs as hotels. So modernisation was viewed as essential in attracting and keeping female customers, whilst female customers were themselves viewed as an important contribution to the modernisation of the pub industry. So it was very kind of self-propagating. So in terms of behaviour, we started identifying quite a lot of difference in regional behaviour within pubs pre-war. So there was a big mass observation movement in Bolton in the northwest, and it was observed that in Bolton, women would not or could not order a drink directly from the bar. They were only allowed to frequent the parlours and the lounges, and they were actively excluded from vaults and tap rooms. That was a male domain. These strictures were universally adhered to by Bolton women, except when they went on holiday. Where did they go on holiday? They went to Blackpool. And it was observed that when they were in Blackpool, they exhibited breakdown behaviour. And it was observed that women drinking in the vaults and the tap rooms, they were ordering their own beer from the bar. But when they went back to Bolton, they slipped back into their normal patterns of behaviour. So that was one region. In the northwest, quite a working class region. There was also a big mass observation study in Fulham, a very affluent suburb of London, which found women in every bar, although the lowest proportion was to be found in the public bar, highest in the private bar. Now, the only woman the mass observers of Bolton saw order a drink at a bar was a middle-class Londoner. Middle-class women, it seemed, were more likely than working-class women to break the taboos in pubs on location and sociability, but generally they did frequent better-class pubs where spatial restrictions were less acute. So what were they drinking? Well, mass observation claimed that in pre-war Bolton, many women had never tasted draft beer, and that their preference was for bottled beer, mainly stout or barley wine or Guinness or spirits. And I want to bring another factor in as to what was influencing women and alcohol at this point. We absolutely cannot underestimate the influence of the temperance movement, which very closely linked alcohol consumption with religion and particularly sin. So the temperance movement was really highly active as we led up to the Second World War and even during it. And they kept kind of tabling proposals to the government to say we should ban all alcohol. Luckily, they were all thrown out. But during the course of this research, I actually interviewed my mum. My mum was born in 1938. And I asked her about what were attitudes about alcohol consumption. My mum was born in Huddersfield to a working class family. And she said alcohol was very definitely associated with low moral standards amongst the working classes. So it's worth having a look at what was the real opposition to women going into pubs? Well, there were a few things going on, three main things. First of all, as I've discussed, there was a view that the pub was in essence a male institution and that women were unsexed if they entered it. And linked to this was the belief that male sociability and conversation was threatened if women were there. And the third one is the association between women, pubs, and sexual morality, whereby female drinkers in pubs were represented as either instigators of illicit sexual unions, or if they were underage, they were the victims of seduction. So in a nutshell, basically, we didn't go into pubs, or females did not go into pubs, partly because we would have ripped our clothes off and all the men would have been in danger. And then something happened. War broke out, 1939. And almost overnight, there was a massive shift in traditional female role paradigms. So women were actively encouraged to join in the war effort, to take on roles that had traditionally only been available to men. And what this created was they had a lot more expendable income. So pre-war, a lot of women were in very low-paid jobs. A lot of them were in clerical or admin jobs. And as they went to work in the munitions factories and in traditional male roles, their salaries doubled, sometimes tripled, and this happened within a matter of months. So they had a lot more money than they'd had before the war started. And linked in with this were war jobs were not by any means the only places in which women became entrenched during the war. They not only took over men's activities, but they took over to a considerable extent what they were doing in their leisure time as well. So perhaps one of the most significant changes was the extent to which they entered into the lives of pubs. So there was this idea, this notion that was developing that women were becoming a little bit more equal. And it was often linked to the belief that the war effort cut across barriers of gender, traditional roles, and women felt that their effort was legitimised. They felt almost permitted to go to the pub because they were contributing as much to the war effort as the men. I'm going to quote another interviewee who said, "There seems to be a feeling that if women are sharing paid work with men, they're entitled to share their pleasures too." So commentators regularly asserted that there was a particular rise in pub participation amongst women in the forces, those that were closest to the war effort, such as the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAF. And this was the group that felt a sense of legitimacy towards going to the pub most keenly. So we had the women that were closest to the war effort said, yep, we feel permitted to go to the pub, along with young female wage earners. So the context of the war reconfigured female work-leisure relationships. And although in some respects it was a temporary reconfiguration, it just demonstrates the crucial impact of historical context upon leisure activities. It will be very, very interesting to find out in these current times how we all change our current leisure activities. So moreover, whereas women had stayed traditionally in their villages, towns and cities where they were born, they'd got a very strict kind of family network around them, they got a social network around them. What happened when war broke out was it opened up mobility for women, especially younger single women. If a woman was unmarried, she was immediately considered mobile, and she could be relocated to a new area where she was freed from the frowning eyes of a family, or the neighbourhood, or the familial controls of the pre-war years. So in effect, she could reinvent herself without fear of retribution. And she was also freed from some of the constraints which were traditional gender roles, such as housework, chores and childminding. It really freed them up from the parochial attitudes of their birthplace. So for women in the forces, particularly, some of the class restrictions were broken down. So by that, I mean, a lot of women who were in the lower ranks felt more at ease mixing with males who were in the upper ranks in the army. If you look at the picture you can see in front of you as well, you can see that both men and women in this picture are drinking beer. So there was a sense of we're all in this together, regardless of what your background or your gender was. And we've also got to take into account that a lot of established leisure networks and activities have been disrupted. So things like the cinema, that had kind of broken down because women wanted that instant gratification. So the pub really kind of took over as a point for contact and socialising. So, of course, another use we made of the pub was a forum for meeting men with whom to establish a more intimate relationship. And within a society where adolescent girlhood was constructed in terms of active heterosexuality, the realm of leisure was closely related to girl-boy relationships. I have to add a caveat that there did remain a measure of kind of a taboo on women entering the pub alone. Women tended to go with friends or with a boyfriend. So the war also had a significant impact on what we were drinking. So whilst the price of draft beer more than doubled over the course of the war, we stopped importing spirits into this country in 1941. So spirits became very scarce and very expensive. So in fact, beer drinking itself rose by 25% as both genders moved to drinking beer. Beer was not rationed throughout the Second World War. And I'd also like to add that there was a lot of evidence that pint drinking was not unknown amongst young women drinkers. It wasn't frowned upon. So cultures of pleasure for young women definitely underwent something of a transformation throughout the war. There was that combination of people mobility. There was higher wages for a lot of women. There was the disappearance of traditional forms of leisure, such as the cinema. And there was this opening up of opportunities. and it led to a shift in attitudes, which saw women workers as deserving of a type of leisure reward. It created the opening for women to be able to go into pubs, if not on their own, but they could go in on their own terms. In the conclusion to one of its reports on women in public houses, mass observation suggested it seems very likely that the large-scale change which war has brought to pub life will persist, and that young people, including young women, will become a permanent feature of the British pub. Wartime pub usage provides evidence of women challenging their gendered leisure norms and remaking their pleasures to suit shifting historical circumstances. I'm going to finish this with a quote from a lady who was in her early 20s when she went into the when we started the Second World War. And I just think it kind of encapsulates the time. She said, I mean, I never dreamed of going into a pub when I was a young girl, but after the war, it was nothing. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I've been involved in 2 research reports, one called the Gender Pint Gap, which is a study into female attitudes and behaviours towards beer in modern times. This report is up online if you want to take a look at it. There are still some prevailing attitudes, particularly amongst older women, about walking into a pub on their own. And from this report, we identified that a lot of it is their mothers or their grandmothers still conditioning their leisure pursuits and activities. The follow-up report, which was called the Beer Agenda, examines this in a little bit more detail in terms of what women think of the pub today. And unfortunately, amongst older women, a lot of them still associate it in a male domain, and it's quite dark, and it's sport-led, and it's not particularly a safe space. A lot of younger women do not have those attitudes, but very definitely the Second World War opened up the public house to women as one of the most pleasurable activities we could take part in. That concludes my talk on women and beer and pubs in the Second World War. So I'm going to come out of this screen and hopefully see you all again. And I'd like to go over to Rachel, if you are there. Oh, I like that. So I'll clap or two. Yeah, just interested to find out if there are any questions.
I haven't seen anything pop up on the chat, to be honest, but I'm sure people do have a lot of thought there to chew over. Does anybody have any questions specifically to ask Annabel while she's still on the call?
Right, I have seen one from Andrew. Hello, Andrew. What were some of the other crazy topics that mass observation covered? One of the topics was how many dogs and cats were put down in the first week of the Second World War? The answer to it was 4,000 dogs in London. That's a crazy topic. One that's really pertinent today is in the first 6 months of the Second World War, a lot of people were reporting they were getting really bizarre dreams. They were having interrupted sleep patterns. And it's been widely reported that when we went into lockdown, a lot of people are having really freaky dreams. And it's because we've had our society disrupted. Right, another question from Chloe. Hi, Chloe. Is there any evidence of women taking over the running of pubs in World War II? Yes, a huge amount of evidence, particularly in London. In fact, more landladies than landlords because the men had gone to war. In terms of roles of women working in pubs, throughout the Second World War, it was traditionally a female role, the females to serve the men who were coming into the pub. It was a very servile role. Interesting question from Lindsay. if it was cool for women to drink pints in the war, when did it start being frowned upon? Do you know what, Lindsay? I genuinely don't know the answer to that question. I'm going to take a little bit of a punt at this, and I might be completely wrong. We drank ale. That's all we drank. Ale, stout, mild, right up to the 1960s. And in the 1960s, we started seeing lager appearing on draft in the UK. And the lager producers originally marketed lager at females because it was very light and it was fizzy and it was pale and it's a girly drink. And all the glassware that they provided for lager was usually halves or very nice stemmed glassware, what a lot of old style pubs call a lady's glass. It could be that then it was frowned upon from the 60s onwards for women to be seen with a chunky ale glass in the hand. Like I say, that's just a punt. I might not be right on that, but it's a guess. Ruth, hiya Ruth, said, how do you think the change impacted the brewery industry? Did breweries brew to different tastes? My Dutch mother-in-law was ridiculed in the 70s for drinking pints. Yeah, me too. Right. Yeah, breweries reduced the strength of beer throughout the Second World War. They doubled the price, but they reduced the strength partly because of a shortage of ingredients. So yeah, we did start to see some changing styles. Styles like mild brown ale, I've mentioned stout and Guinness, was still very, very popular. But other than that, no, they didn't try to brew a beer for women, put it that way. Women drank what men drank. Oh, I've got a long one here from Hayley. Do you genuinely think that the changing style of the way people drink, smaller and different shaped glasses, halves, thirds, and different beer styles is helping bring more women to beer? I hear this a lot, but wonder if it's true and just want male drinkers and camera change makers believe. Right, okay, I'm going to hold my glass up. Glassware was a massive part of the last two reports that we produced, we researched, with a lot of women who only occasionally or didn't drink beer at all, citing the reason that glassware was a big detractor for them. Whenever they thought about beer, they imagined it in terms of a pint pot. They never thought of it as a glass of beer. And yeah, when you look at the research, there was just a massive percentage of females who said if beer was served in nice glassware, it would be a viable alternative for me. From Leslie, do you think the change in how beer was marketed impacted how women were... Oh, hang on, do you think the change in how beer was marketed impacted on how women were viewed? This, how women were viewed drinking beer in pubs. To be honest, no, because there was bit of an educated guess here. Beer was still not marketed towards women. Beer wasn't marketed towards women. In fact, it was virtually all of it marketed towards men right up until the mid-1990s. It was purely the fact that there was not a lot else for them to drink. So what they did was they changed from spirits onto beer. So I don't think marketing had an impact at all. I don't know whether that answers your question, Leslie. Got hello, Pete and Jonah. You were one of the first into the group. In your second study you mentioned, you said there's a generational difference in acceptability of going to the pub. Was there any data gathered on what people were meaning when they mean the pub? That is, there's a big difference, yeah, between a modern craft beer pub and a football sporting pub. Yes, there is some data in there. Within the scope of our second report, we were limited to how many women we could interview because it was quantitative qualitative research, which is extremely expensive to conduct. We had quite a small sample size. There is some information about, a lot of women said they like to go to the gastropubs, they like to go to the kind of modern town centre bars, anything where sport dominated. A lot of women felt that was, they didn't really like walking in on their own. They'd have gone in groups, or they'd have gone in with a boyfriend, much as they would throughout the Second World War. I can send you all a link to the report so you can see some more detailed information that came out of it. Pete, in a pub, I was often refused beer in a pint glass. I remember having to order 2 half pints. In Belgium, they only really drink halves in the special glasses for that particular beer. Oh, hello, Beverly. Yeah, I'm not going to ask what your age is, Beverly, but I had the same experience when I started my drinking career. I grew up in a little village called Flockton, and there was a pub in the village where they would not serve women pints. So this would be 1985. So recent, isn't it? So I had to have my beer in a lady's glass. And in Belgium, yeah, they serve beer perfectly in the right glass for the right drink. Oh, loads more questions coming in. I'm trying to answer all of these. Are breweries doing enough to market beers to women now? I think breweries have turned the corner. Yeah, I think they've realised, and I think part of it has been commercial, that if you market any consumer product to only half of the world's population, you are missing out on half the income from that product. So I think what a lot of breweries have done have said, let's stop genderizing beer and saying it's for men, and making it a gender neutral drink. So, and I also think a lot of breweries know they'll be called out now if they market a beer with a stupid pump clip, or I'm so trying not to name names, but if they are marketing that beer particularly towards the male market, it will be called out. Pete, I lived in Sheffield and then London. Pete, just to let you know, the mass observation on women drinking pints was actually conducted in Sheffield. So that's where it was observed. Farmers Franklin to everyone. My great grandmother drank beer from the outsales. Side door of the pub, sent home in a jug. Funnily enough, when I interviewed my mum, she brought that up as well. She said people used to take jugs to the pub and bring it home. So yeah, that was quite a common thing, certainly amongst working classes and lower classes.
Is that all for questions? That's brilliant. The idea of going to the side door and getting your beer in a jug, it's almost like what we're doing now in lockdown, going to get our refills from the door of the pub.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Annabel, thank you so much. So much info there. Again, it's just, there's so much more that we can all go off and find out more about if we want as well, which is fantastic. Isabel.
Yeah, go and check out Mass Observation, everyone. It's free.
It sounds fascinating as hell. Lovely. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thanks again, Annabel, for all of those facts and stats. We got the PowerPoint working in the end, and we've still got 30 people on, which was a really good turnout for a sunny afternoon. Thank you so much. We've got the festival on until Sunday. We've got one more event today and a load of stuff coming up over the weekend. So if you want some more distractions and excuses to drink lovely beer and learn some new stuff, get on board. And I hope to see you all again over the next few days. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining in. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you very much. See you later, everybody.